and welcome back. We're talking about St. Francis de Sales during this retreat, and because this is the 400th anniversary of his death, special year, a special year of grace for Salesians, like a Jubilee year. So right now we want to talk about his writings, and I will give you some ideas of the writings of St. Francis de Sales as a very important thing. And just to say this, that there is a complete edition of his works, which is in 27 volumes. And Francis de Sales, this work of putting them all together began in 1877 when Pope Pius IX declared him a doctor of the church. One of the things that Pope Pius IX said at that time is that in the writings of Francis de Sales, we discover a heaven-sent doctrine which, like a stream of living water, has watered the vineyard of the church and has helped greatly in achieving the well-being of the people of God. What I want to give you now is highlights of the writings of Francis de Sales. Now, they're not all the same, and they're not the same styles. And the first book, because it's the oldest writing, is called The Controversies. And these were not a book. He didn't know that he wrote this as a book, but when he was a missionary in the Chablais Valley as a young priest, no one was allowed to come to his preaching because the Protestant pastors still had a grip on the people, the Calvinists. So he used to preach in the church with the windows open, and many men used to stand outside the church and smoke and listen to the sermon, but they didn't dare go inside because of the controls from Geneva. So what did he do? He preached in that way. When it became winter and January is so cold, they couldn't leave the windows open anymore. The men were not going to stand outside in the middle of winter because the sermons were always given in the evenings on Sundays, in the evenings, not at Mass, but at Vespers. So he had his cousin with him, and he began to copy out his sermon, write out his sermon. And with his cousin, they would make several copies, 10 copies, and then slip them under the door at night of certain people. This all began on the 25th of January, 1595. This went on until for a year and a half. So in the middle of 1596, people started coming to the church to hear his sermons. People were talking to him now, and he could directly evangelize. So he stopped writing these essays, these sermons. He didn't write them anymore, and he didn't print them out and didn't distribute them. But what happened to all of them? He did not keep them, but his brother did. His brother kept as many as he could. And so Francis de Sales had a nephew. His nephew was Charles Auguste de Sales, who became a priest and then became Bishop of Geneva several years after the death of St. Francis de Sales. And so he knew of these writings. So he went looking for these writings, and then he put them together into a book so that they would not be lost. Now, in this picture, I show you the apartment. See upstairs, that's where Francis lived with his cousin Louis when he stayed in the Chablais Valley, which had been Calvinist Protestant since the 1530s. He arrived in 1595, and so there you are. It was, 60 years of Calvinism. So he had a hard time in winning them over, but he did. And so we find these in the Controversies. Now, the title Controversies came from the man who printed them, but Francis called them Essays of the Church because they really talk about the things that those who objected to the Catholic Church were saying. What about this? What about this? We don't understand this. So he went through those objections one by one to clarify and to teach. This is what the Catholic Church teaches. So they are Essays of the Church. That's the first book, which, as I say, he didn't realize it would ever be a book. They were just papers printed on two sides of a sheet and slipped under the door. The second book instead was published. He published it in 1600, And this was written to answer the attack of a Calvinist preacher, pastor, whose name was Lafay. And by 1598, the whole valley had become Catholic again. And Lafay was going in there telling people, you are with the idolaters. One of the things that the people did is that they loved the ancient customs of raising a crucifix in front of their homes. And so this is in the Alps, this is in the area. And you see the little roof over it because of the winter. And they started doing this because they've been told by their grandparents, that's what we used to do. So they began to put these in front of their homes. And this was in 1599, the year after there was big conversions. So Lafay writes against them and attacks the Catholic practice. So Francis in 1600 writes a book which he calls A Defense of the Standard of the Holy Cross. Standard really meant a flag that you used for your country or for your army. And so our army as Christians, the flag is the cross of Jesus. And so he says it's Jesus Christ crucified who battles evil and battles death to save us. So that's the gist of the book. It's not a real long book, but it's really strong in its argumentation about why we honor and depict the cross of Jesus Christ, the crucifix. The third book is the most famous, and it's called The Introduction to the Devout Life in the French. And I think that in Cantonese and in Mandarin, it's called The Door of Virtue. In Italian, it's called the Philotea. What is it all about? This started from letters of spiritual direction that he wrote to the wife of his cousin. His cousin married this young woman, Louise du Châtel, who came to him for confession when she was getting married, and she loved how Francis was a confessor. And then with her husband, they moved away because her husband was a lawyer and worked for the parliament, which was in a different city. So after they moved, Louise de Châtel de Chamoisy, she wrote to Francis and asked, please continue to direct me by letter. So he did for a couple of years, but then he told her, listen, in the city of Chambéry, there are good Jesuit fathers and they can direct you. So she actually goes to the Jesuit father, the superior, and his name was Jean Fouillet. Jean Fouillet asked her, you have a spiritual director? Yes, I have the Bishop of Geneva. Well, she didn't realize Jean Fouillet, when he was a schoolboy, had been in the same class with Francis de Sales. Since they were 11 years old, they were good friends. So Jean Fouillet asks if he could see the letters. And when he reads them, he is stunned by how wonderful Francis is in giving advice. And so he convinces him to put them into a book. Francis says, I don't have time to write a book. I'm now a bishop. He says, well, you've got the letters already, just edit them a little. So in the summer of 1607, Fouillet sees this. In summer of 1608, Francis gets the letters back from Madame de Chamoisy, and he tries to edit them. It's very difficult. So he just took those letters and reintroduced them. So where the letter says, my dear cousin, you know how you write a letter? If you say dear and the name, dear cousin, dear friend, dear. So he put dear Philotea. Philotea means the one who loves God. And so in 1609, this is published. And it became a bestseller. Right away, more copies were asked, and they reprint and reprint. And the year later, 1610, it was translated into Italian. In 1612, into Latin. In 1613, it was translated into English. And a copy was given to the King of England, King James I, who was not Catholic, but loved this book and kept this book by his bedside. In 1618, it was translated into Spanish. Francis de Sales actually made 3 editions of the book. He made improvements to it as people read it and they asked him more questions, so he improved it. So the final edition, we can say, is in 1618, and there he has the complete book. What does he do in the book? He spells out what is devoted life. In other words, living devoted to the gospel is holiness, and that everyone is called to be holy. And here are the parts of it. The first part, he describes what is true devotion. Because people were afraid of the word holiness, he uses the word devotion. The second part, he talks about a life of loving God and our brothers and sisters. That is what devoted life is. And that love is activated through works of prayer. Part third, prayer. You want to make prayer real, you need to practice virtue. Part fourth, the journey towards salvation, one will encounter trials and temptations and difficulties. How do you overcome those difficulties? And part fifth, he reviews everything that he said already, and he starts with a big examination of conscience. And this part fifth is really a retreat. You can take part fifth and read it for yourself as a retreat. Now, Pope Pius XI, who became Pope 100 years ago in 1922, wrote this: if the devout life were to be read today as it was read in the past, Christian piety certainly would flourish the world over, and the Church of God could rejoice in the assurance of a widespread attainment of holiness by her children. Pope Pius XI, for the 300th anniversary of Francis de Sales' death. And recently, Pope Benedict XVI, in speaking about the Philotheia, that is the introduction to devout life, he says this: to Philotheia, Francis addresses an invitation that could appear revolutionary. It is the invitation to belong to God completely, living fully in God's presence in the world and the tasks of one's own state. What are the duties of your life? Live that completely, be committed to that and committed to God. My intention is to educate those who live in the cities, in the marital state, in the court. Francis writes in his book. And so Pope Benedict says he's writing to everyone. Everyone is called to holiness. The fourth book is more complicated. It's much longer. It's called The Treatise on the Love of God. And after Philotheia, which was an introduction, many people begin to ask him, well, we've done the introduction. How do we get along in the life of devotion? And in fact, Mother Jane de Chantal encourages him and insists on him to write the next thing. So how do we get ahead in devotion? And she offers him a room in the first house of the Visitation Order, where he comes every Sunday. And what does he do? He comes an hour early and he begins to put his ideas on this treatise of the love of God. Now, just to say this, he calls it a treatise, but it's not really a treatise. It's not a highly intellectual book. It is a treatment, it's a conversation. But it is his second great book. It's more complicated, it's less popular, but it's really a work of spiritual direction. So here he goes beyond the basics and he begins to talk about prayer as contemplative. And he also talks about accompanying people on their route, on their journey of holiness. In the first book, he addressed Philotheia. Here he addresses Theotimus, which means he who loves God. And why does he say Theotimus? Because many men said, oh, I read your book, but I knew I shouldn't because it's addressed to women. He says, not addressed to women. You address it to Philotheia. That's a woman's name. He says, Philotheia is the soul. In French, the word soul is feminine. So in this book, he says, well, okay, I'll address it to the heart. In French, the word for heart is masculine. So he calls it Theotimus, he who loves God, just like Philotea, she who loves God. This is written in 12 books. 1 to 4 is a story of divine love, which begins with the birth in the soul and continues in its growth, perfection, and decline and annihilation. Love of God in the person. In book 5, he talks about the two natures of God's love, love of complacence and love of benevolence. Complacence, that God is satisfied with our love, and love of benevolence. God does things for us out of his great goodness and great love for us to make our lives happen and happy. Book 6 and 7 is all about affective love, love of affection that we can practice in prayer. And book 8 and 9 is effective love. That is, how do we put our will together with God's will? How do we submit to God's will or God's good pleasure? What it pleases God to do for us. Sometimes that's difficult. How do we accept it? The last 3 books, 10, 11, and 12, are a summary that give concrete applications for each of the principal teachings in the work. So doing God's will, God's love, love of neighbor. That's all in the last 3. So it's quite more complicated, this book. In the last book, which is called The Spiritual Conferences in English, in French, Les Vrais Entretiens, which really means the true entertainments. And these were dialogue with the Visitation Sisters, the order that he founded in Annecy, in his own city. And every Sunday he would visit with them. And when he would visit with them, some sisters took notes, others sewed, embroidered, and he would talk and they would talk. It was an exchange, it was a dialogue. And that's what entretien means, it's kind of a dialogue. He didn't realize that 3 sisters who were taking notes were doing so because the superior, Mother Jane de Chantal, had asked them to take notes. And they tried to write down every word that he said, because of course there were no ways to record sound in those days. So they're writing everything. After he gave the talk with them and the conference back and forth, and he left and went back to the cathedral, what did they do? These 3 young sisters get together with Jane de Chantal to compare the notes. Let's see did we get the whole thing? And they put together a script. Now, what's important here? We have many of his Salesian maxims are in these true entertainments. And so these spiritual dialogues to the first community of the first Salesian community, the Visitation community in Annecy. It was a community of beginners in religious life. And so he, as a founder, tries to clarify their most simple questions. In a certain sense, he acts as the novice director for them. He willingly accepts all their requests and their questions as the group asks him. He thinks about it for a week, writes down notes, and then he talks with them the next Sunday. And we can find here very practical explanations of his Salesian spirituality. In fact, here's the first articulation of what we can call today Salesian spirituality. How do you live and work in the church? Archbishop Francois Fenelon, who lived in the 1600s, talks about the writings of Francis de Sales are the fruit of grace and of experience. You cannot read anything more useful than the works of St. Francis de Sales, in which everything is pleasing and consoling. Francois Fenelon also founded a group of sisters, an order of sisters, and he based that order on the teachings of Francis de Sales. So very interesting. The next books are more matter of fact, 7 to 10, 4 volumes, are sermons. And some of the sermons are given in the churches, and others are sermons in the Visitation Chapel, Visitation being the community of sisters that he founded. When did he give these sermons? The ones we have are on feast days of Mary and of the saints, or on catechetical days, formation days, Advent, Lent. And it's interesting, he talks about Lent, which in Savoy, in his city of Annecy, is springtime, but he calls it autumn. It's the harvest of souls, the autumn of the spiritual life, when it's important to gather as many fruits and store them up for the whole year. Spiritual fruits. When we look at them, some of them are signed sermons. That is, these are from his own notes, his own manuscripts. And when we look at them, they're clearly logical. And oftentimes he delivered these in front of big crowds. When he was young, he wrote out the whole sermon, but later he just would make an outline, but they're very methodical. The others, instead, 2 volumes of sermons, are called received sermons. And these are from the notes that the listeners wrote. And what's interesting is, in the general outline, they follow his outline, but what was not in his outlines are stories, images, examples that he uses. Often his talks are very simple, and many of the sermons we have are to his spiritual daughters, and they are more like exhortations than like sermons. Very interesting. Pope Paul VI says this: when Francis de Sales writes, the reader has but one fear, as did the listener when he was preaching, and the fear is that he will soon finish much too soon. Interesting. So he's so good, you want to keep hearing him, is what Pope St. Paul says. So the letters now, the next group are his letters. And actually, there are 11 volumes of letters, and there are 3 traditional groups: to persons in the world, to persons in religion, that is, religious life, and then letters that are of spiritual direction. What do we see in the letters? Well, the quality here really is very different from letter to letter, because he's writing to different people, and according to his relationship to them, he writes differently. But this gives us a sense of who Francis really is. His early letters are often about his apostolate in the Chablais Valley, meeting the Calvinists and bringing them to Catholicism. Very enthusiastic letters. His later letters are themselves the apostolate, because they are letters of spiritual direction. What do we see here? And the man who collected all the letters, an Englishman by the name of Henry Benedict Mackey, wrote this: in the letters, we see Francis who speaks from the heart. We see the tenderness of his friendships and his filial piety. We see the ardor of his patriotism and his loyalty to his prince. We see his attachment to the Catholic Church. We see his devotion to the Pope. We see his zeal for souls. We see his immense love for God. Father Mackey says this: the highest, most noble, and purest sentiments of his heart flow into his letters. Since Francis was passionate about God and man, Pope John Paul II says, his gaze on people was fundamentally optimistic, and he never failed to invite them, according to his expression, to flourish where they had been planted. Today, the writings of Francis de Sales are part of classical literature. It is a sign that his teaching finds an echo in the human hearts and satisfies our deepest aspiration. And Pope John Paul II ends this by saying to the people, be instructed by his example and by his writings, which remain of great relevance. So here is a saint talking about the writings of another saint. Are there other writings? Yes, there are. And we have a number of volumes, 5 volumes, which are called opuscules, which means they are essays or pamphlets or studies of interior life, or some pastoral projects, which he writes for the priest. He also writes the spiritual directory, which is how to live the Salesian spirit in daily life. So that's the spiritual directory, or the directoire spirituel. Okay, so this is it. Now, just to say this, a good friend of mine who is an author and a publisher, Father Joseph Korpening, an oblate of Francis de Sales from Philadelphia in the USA, he makes this point. Francis is the patron of writers and journalists. He's often depicted with a quill pen in his hand. But the fact is this: Francis only wrote when he could not speak directly. In fact, he comes from an oral tradition. And so his writings read like someone who is talking, not like essays, logical essays that are academic. No, he's very conversational. So Father Joe Corpening talks about it in this way. This is a very important idea. It means that Francis is live and direct. And another great scholar of Francis de Sales is Professor Wendy Wright, mother of 3 children. Her husband is also a professor, and she taught on Christian spirituality at Omaha University, and her main area was Francis de Sales. In fact, she's the one who reintroduced Francis de Sales to the English-speaking world in the 1980s. And I also know her very well. So Wendy Wright says this: Francis de Sales claimed that his teaching was not at all original. However, he presents traditional advice about the spiritual life, but in such a way as to adapt it to the circumstance of lay people. Now, Wendy Wright, who is a lay woman, appreciates this. And this is the newness of Francis de Sales. He's the first one really to write to laity, not to bishops, not to religious, not to monks, not to nuns, but to laity in a very accessible way. Now, in the old Roman breviary that we used before 1962, they had for the Feast of Francis de Sales, there is this phrase here: the writings of St. Francis de Sales, filled with heavenly doctrine, are a bright light in the church, pointing out to souls an easy and safe way to arrive at the perfection of Christian life. That was in the Roman breviary, and it introduced the idea, who is Francis de Sales. So hopefully this is of use to you, so you can see the writings. The most important are the Introduction to Devout Life and the Treatise on the Love of God. But also the spiritual conferences are quite useful, and hopefully you have good copies in your own language. I know that the introduction, or the book on virtue, as it's called, I think in Chinese languages, is all about the door of virtue, is the most fundamental. And if you can read that and spend some time with it, you'll know the heart of Francis de Sales, that heart that Don Bosco imitated to be with young people. So thanks a lot for listening.